Hello, today is March 8th, and for today's word of the day, we are going to be reading our first reading for this coming Sunday, which is going to be our second Sunday in Lent. We, as you know, did not have in-person worship this past Sunday because of very icy conditions, but as those have changed, we are looking forward to worshiping once again in person and beginning the season of Lent off right. We are beginning with our Lenten Wednesday services as well. So on this Wednesday, uh, i.e., tomorrow, we will be having our meal at 5 p.m. Social Outreach Committee is uh, handling that. Our soup and sandwich meal at 5 p.m. and then worship after at 6 p.m. So come for a meal and stay for worship. We hope you enjoy this as we worship with our neighbors at Gwinn United Methodist. So that's something to look forward to through the rest of this season of Lent, which begins tomorrow. But today we are reading our texts not for this past, not for tomorrow, but for this coming Sunday. Our first reading is from Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 12, and verses 17 through 18. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is a text that I was able to go in some great detail recently, not so very long ago, maybe a few months ago, our ongoing Genesis study, which if you are able to make a 9 a.m. Bible study on Sunday mornings, please join us. All really are welcome, and you can jump in at any time. In fact, in the next couple weeks would be a good time to start because we are transitioning actually away from Abraham and Sarah toward Jacob's stories. So as we transition again, please feel free, jump on in to this study. Um, it is, I think, a study that I enjoy doing because we do the really deep dive approach. This is not just hitting the high points, reading the stories we know, but really walking through the entire book of Genesis and reading every section and getting a sense of what is the purpose of this section. So yes, we even read the genealogies and all the lists of names and those stories that very rarely get any airtime in worship, um, especially Jacob's misadventures, especially as we have gone on some of the lesser known stories of Abraham. Uh, it's been a mix. Genesis is a book that is a mixture of many different things, of sacred stories, as we have discovered, of genealogies, which serve to provide a narrative structure to otherwise what would seem like seemingly free-floating stories, that the genealogies give a skeleton to the rest of the work, as well as provide other information, uh, reveals more about the writers sometimes than the history that sits behind it, um, as well as a lot of great discussion. It sparks a lot of great discussion about um, the nature of God and the nature of human beings. That most of Genesis is a portrayal of people post Adam. That is, you have this, it begins with this story of creation, that God sees creation as good, and then there is a falling away. And whether you want to subscribe a lot of importance to Adam or not, there is a falling away. There is a broken relationship between God and people, and a broken relationships between people and other people. And so Genesis, in some sense, is a story of not just um, one nation coming into being, Israel, because it is that, but it is also the story. It is in the stories of God and of Noah, in the stories of God and Abraham, in the stories of Jacob and his brother Esau, in the story of Joseph that we will have this summer. In all of those, the broad theological understanding we get, the broad idea or of the purpose of God is always toward reconciliation. God is always seeking to repair broken relationships, whether it is between God and human beings or between human beings uh, and each other, especially within that family bond. Okay, this is a lot of introduction for something that a Genesis passage that sometimes is a little hard to understand, and that it required a lot of context as we were reading the story. I want to draw you not towards the beautiful image of Abraham looking up at the stars and God saying, "Your descendants shall be like the stars in the sky." That's a pretty apparent promise. It's a grand promise, especially for someone who at that point had no children. How can you have descendants as numerous as the stars if you have no children to speak of? That's a huge promise. God is a promise maker, God is a promise keeper. But okay, so that brings us to these animals: a heifer, a goat, a ram, the birds, and we cut them and lay them in half, and then we wait until dark. What is the meaning of that? Well, it is not, as might be assumed, this is not a sacrifice. This is not a Levitical sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice in the sense of other sort of practices. There is no altar here. There is no thank offering. So what is this? Why this? Why does Abraham have to be a butcher? Well, that gets explained by 17 and 18. Much of the Abraham stories, especially the movement out of Egypt or into Egypt, many of Abraham's stories are written by people who have a memory of the Exodus. So a lot of Genesis is written looking ahead to the book of Exodus, to the stories of Moses. And so there is a practice of that was known to ancient Israel, that happened in Jeremiah's time, of splitting an animal in half and walking through it. And when you did that, that was a public demonstration that you were going to keep this promise. So you would split an animal in half, and this is usually a very serious promise. In Jeremiah's time, the city elders, the priests, and the king, and the counselors walked through animals after promising to free all the slaves in the city. This was during a siege. They wanted to keep the people who were enslaved on their sides, and so they promised, after the siege, we will free everyone. And so to show that they were going to keep that promise, they split these animals in half and walked through them. The implication being, if you split an animal in half and you walk through it, you are saying, if I break this, let me be like that split animal. Serious implication. cross my heart and hope to die kind of stuff. So in Jeremiah's time, of course, the city councilors didn't keep that promise. Jeremiah has a field day with them. Here, you have this same practice being done, animals being split in half. Someone is about to make a promise. Someone is about to pass through the middle of these as they make a serious, serious promise, a covenant. And when a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch are made to pass between these pieces, actually it says they passed between these pieces. It doesn't say Abram carries them through there. They pass mysteriously of their own accord. Those two things, remember we're thinking of the Exodus, are meant to represent God. That the smoking fire pot is the pillar of fire, and the smoke is the pillar of cloud, and the flaming torch is the pillar of fire. Those two things that led the people through the wilderness, that were the representations of God. And so you have these two symbols of God passing through the symbol of a promise being kept. And so God is binding God itself to the most serious oath possible. So you have the promise at the beginning of the story. That is a wonderful, beautiful image of the stars. But the image of God, God's self, passing through the split animals is a representation of God's seriousness, of God's commitment to this relationship, of God's willingness to put God's own self invested into this covenant relationship. That's the heart of the promise, that God will never let go of this faithful relationship with Abraham, that God will always be with the people of Israel. And by extension, because we are by extension, God will always be with us. God will always remain faithful to us. This was a lot. I hope you're having a good week. Stay warm, stay healthy. Bye-bye.